Chapter 1. Before Dawn at the Old Forge. Long before the village cock crowed, 12-year-old Martin stood at the forge door with frost on his shoes and a bundle under one arm. Inside were a spare shirt, black bread, and his mother's last wool thread around the knot. His tenant family had too many mouths for the coming winter. Apprenticeship under Master Osric meant food, work, and a future. But Martin heard the sleeping forge breathe and feared he would fail before the fire was even lit. A bar slid from within, and Master Osric filled the doorway, broad as an ox yoke, beard singed short, one eyelid puckered by an old spark. He said nothing of welcome. With scarred knuckles he raked ash from the banked coals, fed them charcoal, and coaxed a red-eye awake. Martin stepped forward. Osric's glance stopped him. "Watch first," he said. "Hands come after eyes." Osric pointed to the shed behind the forge, where sacks of charcoal waited like black loaves. Martin dragged one against his chest, coughing as dust filled his nose and sleeves. At the threshold, his foot caught. A scatter of fuel rolled across the hard earth. Osric's voice cracked sharper than the tongs. "Pick up every piece. That heat is plowshares promised, hinges owed, and bread not yet earned." Martin knelt, cheeks burning, and gathered the black fragments one by one. Then Osric set Martin at the bellows. The handles looked plain enough, but each pull changed the half like weather. Too quick, and sparks spat wastefully. Too slow, and the red heart dulled under ash. Martin's arms shook before breakfast had even been mentioned. Osric stood beside him, correcting the pace with 2 fingers against the wood. Pull. Let it fill. Pull again. At last the fire breathed evenly, and Martin breathed with it. Pale daylight had barely reached the yard when the village found the forge. A farmer came first, plowshare bent against a stone in the lower field. Behind him waited a carter with an iron wheel strap sprung loose, then a woman clutching a hinge from a door that would not shut. Martin kept to Osric's side, listening to complaints, prices, and promises, and saw that iron held bread, roads, houses, beasts, and debts together. Only after the customers had settled into waiting did Osric place the tongs in Martin's hands. The iron at their jaws glowed yellow, alive and angry. A burst of sparks leapt from the anvil, and Martin jerked back. Heat kissed 2 fingers before he could hide them. Osric glanced once. "You'll keep them," he said, and returned to the blow. Martin swallowed his shame, watching those scarred hands hold steady. Osric did not slow for Martin's sore fingers. He sent him after the fuller, then the small hammer, then a broom for the scale flaking black beneath the anvil. "Stand clear unless I call," he snapped, already turning from plowshare to wheelstrap. At the doorway, villagers watched every stumble. Martin felt their eyes as sharply as sparks, learning that a forge had no private foolishness. Between errands, Martin watched the farmer shift his weight by the doorway, guarding the bent plowshare as if hunger already clung to it. Osric finished a strap, wiped soot from his wrist, and looked at the boy's burned fingers. Then he took a plain nail blank from the pile and laid it before him. "You wanted to learn," he said. "Heat this properly. Not white, not dead red. The farmer waits." Chapter 2. Spoiled Iron and Small Corrections. Martin set the narrow bar among the coals as if placing bread in an oven. But the fire gave no simple answer. Too little air, and the iron sulked dark. Too much, and the heart of the hearth roared white. His arms worked the bellows unevenly while his eyes chased color through smoke. Osric stopped him with one hard word, turned the bar and said, "Heat, fuel, time. Watch all 3. Eager to prove he understood, Martin pulled the bellows harder. The fire brightened too fast, swallowing Osric's warning in its roar. For a moment, the bar shone almost beautiful. Then its edge spat stars and broke into a grainy crumble. Osric snatched it free with his tongs and held the ruined end before the boy's face. That was iron gone, charcoal gone, and a promise to the farmer made poorer. Osric gave him scraps small enough for practice, and tongs long enough to keep skin from fire if the hand knew them. Martin's grip pinched too near the jaw, then too loose. A glowing piece leapt from the iron beak, struck the floor, and kissed his wrist before he jerked away. Osric crushed it still with his boot. "Tongs are fingers," he said. "Yours are not trained yet." For punishment and practice, Osric set Martin to nails. They were needed for doors, carts, shoes, and every repair waiting beyond the threshold, yet each one began as a stubborn sliver of iron. Martin struck too hard and made flat heads with crooked shanks. He struck too softly and split the point. Osric took one heat, 3 clean blows, a twist, and a finished nail lay straight. Strength, Martin saw, was only the loudest part of skill. At the doorway, a waiting villager leaned on a broken latch and saw the bent nails cooling beside Martin's block. "If those hold a door, I'll sleep in the hedge," he laughed. Others smiled before turning away. Heat rose in Martin's face hotter than the forge. Osric did not comfort him. He only swept the failures aside and set down another blank. Martin learned the doorway, judged even boys before their names were worth speaking. The hinge strap looked sound when Martin lifted it from the trough, black and hissing, and that fooled him worst of all. Osric took it without a word, set one end against the anvil, and bent it cold. The iron snapped sharp as dry bone. "Too soon," he said, holding the broken grain where Martin could see it. "A door will trust this before it fails. So will the man who paid for it." By afternoon, Martin no longer counted the failures. He watched the color, breathed with the bellows, and let the hammer fall lighter than his fear wanted. One nail came out uneven, its head squat, its point a little blunt, but the shank ran straight enough. Osric turned it once between blackened fingers, said only, "This one will serve," and placed it with the kept work. Martin stared at that small iron proof until the next blank glowed. Osric let Martin stand behind the anvil when Watt, a tenant farmer, brought a loose hinge and a cracked hook from his byre. Watt offered barley after threshing, then swore the reeve had taken his coin. Osric named charcoal, iron, and the strap Martin had spoiled that morning. No anger rose, only counting. Martin listened as reputation, hunger, and delayed grain weighed against a repair small enough to fit in one hand. Chapter 3. Payment in Grain, Promises, and Pride. Before the first cart creaked into the yard, Osric set a stained ledger on the forge threshold. Its pages smelled of smoke and damp leather. Beside names and thumb marks stood debts in barley, eggs, hauling days, and grudges Martin did not yet understand. He was not allowed to answer customers or name a price. He fetched charcoal, held finished iron for inspection, and learned that accounts could burn as fiercely as coals. Watt returned before noon with a ploughshare bundled in sacking, its cracked edge showing through like a wound. He needed it before the ground baked hard, yet his purse held only 2 clipped pennies. "After harvest," he said. Osric asked whose rent stood unpaid, how much seed remained, and whether Watt's sons could haul charcoal. Martin held the heavy iron and felt, through its split, the weight of bread not yet grown. Soon the doorway filled with smaller troubles. A woman held out a sickle bent in the stubble. A boy brought a hinge that rattled loose from his mother's chest. An old man wanted a pothook mended before supper. One offered 6 eggs, another a sack of oats, another a day's hauling when the road dried. Each needed Osric's fire. Each looked wounded when he named its cost. Osric lifted the hinge with blackened tongs and made Watt look past it. "This is not only iron made whole," he said. "It is charcoal burned, bar wasted when a fool strikes cold, an hour when another man waits, and rent the reeve will not take in promises." Martin, standing silent by the threshold, understood then that customers saw the mended thing, while the smith counted everything consumed to make it possible. Osric wrapped the repaired hinge in sacking and put it into Martin's hands. The widow had paid with brown eggs and a promise to mend one of Osric's torn shirts. Martin walked straighter than usual, proud that finished iron trusted his grip. But at her door she asked whether the second hinge might wait until Martin's next errand. He returned, knowing even delivery carried a bargain back to the forge. When Wat was gone, Osric did not close the ledger. He turned it toward Martin and drew a short black mark beside the farmer's name. Before the others, he said, tapping the page with the knife he used for scraping scale. The mark promised Wat's plowshare fire, charcoal, and time before easier work. It also left Osric waiting on grain not yet cut. Martin sought trust and danger sharing one narrow line. By noon, the forge mouth had become a court of muttering. Men compared Osric's prices in low voices, weighing eggs against oats, coin against promises, pride against need. Yet the broken iron stayed, cart pins, dull blades, loose hinges, a shoe split from a mare's hoof. Martin watched them grumble and leave their burdens behind. A smith's name, he learned, could hold off insult, but it also drew every necessity to his door. After sunset, Osric laid the waiting iron in rows across the packed earth. Watts cracked plowshare first, then sickles with bitten edges, cart straps, hinge plates, and a bundle of nail blanks. These before harvest, he told Martin, or men go hungry and rent goes unpaid. Martin's arms shook from bellows and errands, soot drying on his face. For the first time, he felt how iron, bread, debt, and pride would all ripen together. Chapter 4. The Harvest Rush. Long before the sky paled, Osric shook Martin awake and uncovered the banked coals. Harvest had not yet spoken, but it had already arrived. Martin hauled charcoal in 2 trips, topped the quench trough, and laid tongs, sledges, and hand hammers where Osric could reach them. By the doorway, Watts' plough iron waited beside dull sickles and cracked fittings. The yard was silent, yet the day was already pressing on his back. By first light, voices crowded the doorway. Watt held up his cracked plowshare and swore his strips would lie useless without it. Another man thrust forward sickles, crying that ripe grain would not wait. A carter named Rent Day, a widow named Bread. Osric listened to all and answered none quickly. He set Watt's iron before the sickles, the cart strap after, the hinge last. Martin understood. Loudness did not rule the forge. Consequence did. Watt's plowshare went into the coals, and Osric put Martin close enough to feel judgment in the heat. Hold there. Fetch the fuller. Watch the colour. Martin obeyed, remembering the bar he had once burned to crumbling sparks. He eased the bellows instead of forcing them, saving charcoal breath by breath. Outside, Watt stood silent. If that iron failed, his field rent and winter bread failed with it. When the plowshare left the anvil, there was no triumph, only the next blade. Sickles came by the dozen, their crescent edges dulled on straw and stone. Martin held, turned, filed, and struck until sweat ran into his eyes and his fingers cramped around the tongs. Sparks jumped against his sleeves. Osric watched every motion. None of it was elegant, but each sharpened edge meant grain cut before rain could ruin it. Hooves struck the yard stones hard enough to turn every head. A carter dragged in a sweating horse. One shoe twisted loose before the wagon could haul sheaves and rent grain to the Lord's barn. Martin caught the bridle with both hands while fear ran up his arms. Osric worked fast, but not blindly. Rasp, fit, nail, clench. One lame horse could stop a cart, a pavement, and a market road. By noon, the charcoal stack had sunk to a black scatter against the wall. Osric's temper narrowed with it. No second heat for clumsy hands, he snapped, sending Martin to the charcoal burner's shed beyond the coppiced wood. Martin returned bent under sacks, face streaked, shoulders burning, afraid the fire would die before the orders did. Unpaid grain, delayed coin, woodland labour, and every wasted glow now seemed part of the same debt. Late in the rush, Osric set a cracked cart strap on the anvil and pushed the hammer toward Martin. The order was small, but the cart would carry sheaves before dusk. Martin swallowed, drew the iron at a dull yellow, and struck without scattering the edge thin. Osric watched, arms slack with weariness. When the strap cooled straight enough, he only grunted and handed it to the waiting carter. After dark, the yard emptied. Watt's plowshare, the carter's strap, the sharpened sickles, and the new shoe had gone back to fields, carts, and stables. Martin flexed hands blistered raw, Knuckles burned white at the edges, fingers stiff as old twigs. Osric closed the ledger, then slid it back and let Martin mark the last repair tally himself. By the banked fire, Martin still looked young and spent, but no longer only afraid. Chapter 5. Rules of the Guild Road. In the slower days after harvest, broken tools still came through Osric's doorway, but no one shouted to be first. Martin mended a pothook, straightened a sickle tang, and reset a loose cart pin while Osric worked nearby without seizing the hammer from him. Corrections still came sharp, and Martin still answered as apprentice. Yet he felt the change. Osric watched for judgment now, not rescue. From a shelf above the quench tub, Osric took a small punch worn smooth at the grip. Its end bore the shop mark, a crooked cross inside a ring. He set it against a finished hinge and struck once. "That says whose iron this is," he told Martin. "If it snaps, cheats weight, or shames a door, they bring it back to me." Martin stared at the mark, suddenly heavier than the hammer. The next market morning, a town searcher ducked through the forge doorway, cloak damp, tablets under one arm. He lifted hinges, weighed nails in his palm, and studied Osric's mark without ceremony. Then he asked Martin's term, his age, and whether he was fed and bound properly. Osric answered evenly, but paid the quarter dues in coin. Martin saw it then. Even his master's hammer rang beneath another man's rules. While Osric and the searcher counted coins, Martin kept his eyes on the slack tub and listened. Completion fee, journey money, guild entry, lodging in town, a hammer of his own, tongs, files, leather apron, and a master willing to speak for him. Each word landed harder than a blow. His father's rent was paid in grain, not silver. Skill might open the road, Martin understood, but coin guarded the gate. Near noon, a town apprentice arrived with a packet of rivets from his master's shop, his leather apron clean and his cap cocked high. He glanced at Martin's soot-black sleeves and the hinge cooling by the trough. "Village work," he said, laughing. "Strong enough for pigsties, maybe." Martin's face burned hotter than the iron. Osric did not defend him. "Set the rivets down," he said. "Then let your master's boy watch ours finish." Osric laid 2 narrow bars before Martin and named the task. A matched pair of strap hinges, 1 weld each, eyes rounded clean, leal equal, no wasted heat. This was not Watt's plough or a widow's door needing haste. No customer waited, yet Martin's stomach tightened more. He worked slowly, filing the burrs, measuring by thumb and sight. When Osric turned both pieces over, Martin felt workmanship become something that could be judged. Osric set the hinges beside his own marked work and spoke as if naming a price. A man does not become master by standing in one doorway. Martin would have to take leave, carry a recommendation, and hire himself where strangers judged him by the day. Other hearths used other measures. The road promised wages, tools, proof. It also meant tolls, hunger, permission, and no Osric between him and failure. That night, after Osric barred the forge door, Martin touched the rough hinges with 2 burned fingers and made his vow without speaking it. He was still bound, still poor, still waiting on another man's permission. Yet the road had shape now: earn wages, save silver, buy his own tools, master the pieces searchers trusted, endure strange hearths, and someday strike iron beneath a mark accepted as Martin's own. Chapter 6. Journeyman Smoke. With frost silvering the yard, Martin stepped out from Osric's doorway, no longer an apprentice, yet not safely a man of his own. His bundle held bread, a spare shirt, and the worn handle of his first hammer. Osric gave him 2 names to speak in town, then only nodded toward the road. Behind Martin, the dawn fire breathed in the old forge. Ahead waited tolls, beds paid by the night, and strangers judging his hands. By the 3rd market town, Martin knew the road counted sharper than any master. A day's wage from shoeing mules or drawing nails thinned quickly into rye bread, small ale, a straw bed, bridge toll, and a new wedge for a cracked hammer eye. He slept beside coffin carriers, boots under his arm, coins tied inside his shirt. His shoulders ached from walking, but hunger taught him arithmetic better than Osric ever had. The town smith who hired him took Osric's recommendation, then tested every habit it had made. Martin's hinges were strong, but the master filed one edge clean and made him see the burr. A strap he would have sent home in the village was returned for tighter fit. Even his tool edges were judged too blunt. In that sharper shop, Martin learned that competence carried only as far as the doorway where it was known. Beside the market square, the forge never waited for seasons alone. Merchants wanted locks that looked trustworthy. Carters came shouting over split-wheel bands. Innkeepers needed cooking hooks before supper, and servants pressed broken knives or buckles into Martin's palm with orders to hurry. Farmers bargained with patience born of fields. Town customers watched the finish, counted minutes, and argued in coin. Martin learned to strike quickly, file cleanly, and answer without lowering his eyes. One afternoon, a guild searcher and a cloth merchant's steward came to inspect a batch of hinges and locks. Martin had shaped 3 of the cleanest pieces, but the town master answered every question. The searcher weighed the iron, checked the finish, and approved only after seeing the master's stamped mark. Martin stood with soot on his sleeves, skilled enough to make the work, yet too low to sell it, stamp it, or name its price. In that shop, skill seemed to live inside objects Martin had never owned. A swage block took repeated curves cleanly. Narrow tongs held buckle tongues without slipping. Fine files erased roughness he once would have accepted, and leather-lunged bellows gave steadier heat than Osric's old pair. Martin watched, copied, and learned the hardening color for knife edges. Each lesson thrilled him. Each tool reminded him how poor a free hand could be. For 6 weeks, Martin kept back pennies by sleeping cold, drinking water instead of ale, and eating the crusts other men left. Then he paid a toolmaker for a square-faced hammer balanced to his grip, not borrowed, not stamped with another master's ownership. It was only one tool, wrapped in oiled cloth beneath his pallet, yet when he lifted it, he imagined a future forge being bought piece by hungry piece. When Martin turned back toward familiar fields, he did not return as Osric's frightened boy. He knew town finish, market haste, guild silence, and the weight of another man's mark. In his bundle lay the hammer bought with hunger. Ahead waited harder purchases, rent for a wall, dues for permission, charcoal on credit, an anvil he might only borrow, and neighbors who would have to trust Martin's name before his fire could feed him. Chapter 7. A Hearth of His Own. The widow's outbuilding gave Martin one narrow bay beside the village road, if he paid each month and kept the sparks from her thatch. Smoke crawled from a cracked wall before finding the roof hole. The hearthstones shifted under his boots. Still, he set his bundle down as if claiming a kingdom. The doorway stood open to every passing eye, and this time any crooked work would carry his name. On the floor of that rented bay, Martin unwrapped his fortune. The hammer's old handle was polished by a dead man's palm. Beside it lay 2 tongs, a hardy tool, a punch, and a whetstone tied in cloth. These were wages turned into iron by miles of road and hunger. Yet the great lack sat heavier than all of them, no anvil. For that, he must pay old Aldred by the hour. The town officer came with a wax tablet, a clerk, and no patience for dreams. He entered Martin's name, measured the shop mark he meant to use, and warned him against false weight, weak hinges, cut prices, and selling work outside the bounds granted him. The fee took nearly every coin from Martin's purse. When the officer left, permission remained on the table, but so did the question of charcoal and supper. Eleanor came to Martin without ribbons or dowry songs, but with a small chest, 2 good linens, and women who trusted her word at well and bakehouse. By rushlight she set his scattered promises into columns: rent, charcoal, grain, guild dues, Aldred's anvil hours, work owed before ploughing. Martin could read heat better than figures. Eleanor tapped the page and made him see that their hearth would be fed by both. Long before the lane brightened, Martin coaxed his own coals awake with flint, straw, and a prayer he would not have spoken before Osric. The bellows dragged stiffly, coughing heat, and the charcoal vanished faster than Eleanor's columns allowed. He began with village work small enough to trust: nail blanks, a hinge strap, a cracked pothook. Each cartwheel outside made him pause, wondering whether custom or judgment had arrived. Near mid-morning, Watt stepped into Martin's doorway with a plough coulter split at the fastening, mud still wet on it. He turned it in his hands as if weighing Martin with the iron. Osric would have set it right for a mark after harvest, he said, and late fieldwork fed no children. Martin thought of charcoal, Aldred's anvil fee, Eleanor's ledger. Then he named a fair price and did not lower his eyes. By noon, the smoke from Aldred's better chimney seemed to lean across the lane. A carter repeated what the older smith had said, that Martin was a lad with rented iron, paying for another man's anvil, taking work before his name had weight. Others only glanced from Martin's doorway to Aldred's roof. Yet 2 pennies, 3 eggs, and Watt's promise lay in Eleanor's keeping, small proof against a loud doubt. 7 days left Martin with mended hooks, straightened straps, patched hinges, and a plough fitting cooling true. Payment came unevenly, a few pennies, a measure of rye, more promises than comfort. Behind him, Eleanor thinned pottage, counted grain, and set aside coin for rent before hunger could argue. At the doorway, Martin looked at his soot-black hands, proud of earnings that already belonged to charcoal, creditors, and everyone now trusting his fire. Chapter 8. The village measures him. Before the village cock crowed, Martin crouched at the rented hearth and fed the first coal as if it were coin. No master stood behind him now. Every spark, delay, and wasted stroke would answer to his name. Eleanor bent over the ledger, naming rent, charcoal credit, and Aldred's anvil fee before breakfast. At the doorway, broken sickles, a bent hinge, and a plough iron waited for daylight and judgment. Watt came again with the ploughshare wrapped in damp sacking, its edge torn where stones had bitten deep. The clouds were gone, he said. Another dry day would harden the field. When Martin named the price, Watt snorted that Osric had never counted every coal aloud. Martin kept his voice steady. Charcoal had risen, iron was not free, and haste still took time. Eleanor entered Watt's promise beside the charge. In the field beyond the lane, Martin watched Watt set the mended share into the furrow, while 2 neighbors slowed their own teams to see. The first pull struck a buried stone, and Martin felt it in his teeth. The edge held. Soil rolled cleanly aside. Watt bent, rubbed the seam with a dirty thumb, and only said it would do. By sunset, another farmer had left a cracked coulter at Martin's door. Mid-morning brought a carter limping in from the rutted road, 1 wheel iron split, and the market bell already in his voice. Martin set aside the cracked coulter, hearing the waiting farmer curse under his breath. There was no clean strap long enough, so he scarfed 2 scraps, welded them hot, and punched new holes. The carter paid with 1 penny and a promise after sale. Eleanor wrote it down without smiling. Then Rowan the horseholder led in a gelding that stamped at smoke and snapped its rope. Men at the doorway fell quiet. Some had seen Martin drop tongs as a boy. He lifted the hoof, paired too close, and the horse jerked hard. Rowan cursed and reached for the halter. Martin breathed, reset his grip, cooled the shoe, nailed clean through horn, and rasped the edge smooth. The gelding stood square. By noon, Master Aldred from town stood in the doorway, turning Martin's strap repair under his thumb. He asked why a village smith marked work so near the market road, and whether such prices had guild leave. Martin felt heat rise in his face, but bowed no lower than courtesy required. His dues were paid, his mark registered, his iron sound. Aldred found no crack, only the silence of men listening. Near evening, the miller came with the lower gate hinge wrapped in sacking, its pin worn thin and the strap torn where the water shook it daily. Without it, grain waited in sacks and households waited for flour. Martin upset the iron, welded a thicker eye, and set a new pin. For 3 days the wheel beat against it. The hinge held. After that, people brought him word before asking Aldred's price. Before the week ended, Martin's sill was crowded with sickles, pothooks, a cart pin, and 2 horseshoe blanks chalked for mourning. Then the Lord's messenger ducked beneath the lintel, clean-booted among the ash, and counted the work with narrow eyes. How many shoes could Martin turn in a day? Could he fit wagon iron? The question sounded like custom, but felt like summons. His good name had climbed beyond the village. Chapter 9. Orders before the campaign. A bent coulter glowed on Martin's anvil. Watt's sickle waited by the wall, and Eleanor was weighing oats against 2 hinge repairs when the reeve filled the public doorway. He carried no broken tool, only the Lord's words. Martin was named for cart bands that had reached market, for mill iron that held, for horses that stayed shod on rutted roads. The farmers heard it too. Their iron had just become second in line. Eleanor wiped the board clean with her sleeve and wrote the Lord's work first: horseshoes, nail bundles, cart pins, spear sockets, knives, arrowheads. Watt's sickle and the widow's hinge slid below the line. Martin counted 6 baskets of charcoal, 3 short bars of iron, and scraps not worth trusting to a horse. The reeve might pay in coin before Lammas, Eleanor said, but neighbours remembered delays longer than debts. By midday, the yard stank of hoof smoke. Martin took each lifted foot against his leather apron, rasped fast, tested the hot shoe, then barked for nails before the horse could wrench free. Riders cursed the weight. Martin cursed louder when they pulled too soon. 1 nail driven high could lame a gelding before it reached the muster. Behind them, ordinary owners held reins and watched their own animals lose the day. After dark, glory became counting. A hired man worked the bellows until his shoulders shook, and Martin's younger helper drew rough tapers from the heat. Martin sat near the lamplight with files, punch, and gauge, rejecting heads too heavy, sockets too loose, knife backs too thin. Spear fittings, belt hooks, and small blades piled in baskets like debts. Each mistake bore his mark, though other hands had struck the blow. Watt came at last with his plough iron wrapped in sacking, mud still wet on his boots. 1 strip had cracked where Martin had warned it would, and the lower field had to be opened before rain. Martin looked from Watt's face to the reeve's baskets of unfinished arrowheads. He could not heap both. When he said tomorrow, Watt's mouth tightened. Tomorrow might cost rent, bread, and a friendship first marked in Osric's ledger. The reeve returned before sunset and set silver pennies on Martin's table, more bright coin than the forge usually saw in a month. "Half now," he said, "the rest after inspection, if every bundle matched the count and no order slipped." Eleanor paid the charcoal man, settled part of the rent, and bought meal enough to quiet the children's hunger. Still, she touched the coins lightly. "War money," she said, "always bought more than iron." At the chapel bell, the lane filled with men called from fields, carts creaking under sacks, horses tossing against new shoes. Martin stood by the forge doorway and saw his labour departing on every side. Iron rims on wheels, sockets on spear shafts, knives at belts, buckles biting leather. Mothers watched without blessing. Some boys grinned too bravely. Watt said nothing. The Lord's order had taken hands, beasts, time, and peace from the village. When the lane emptied, the forge sounded too large. Charcoal dust lay where full baskets had stood, and the iron rack showed short stubs instead of bars. Martin flexed fingers swollen from tongs and hammer, then faced the waiting heap: Watt's plough iron, a split hinge, cart nails, a dull sickle. The reeve knew his name better now. So did every neighbour he had delayed. Outside, tax talk had already begun. Chapter 10. Short iron, thin bread. 2 mornings after the men marched, the reeve stood in Martin's doorway with a waxed tally and no smile. "Campaign pay," he said, "did not cancel rent, tallage, or cart service owed to the Lord." Behind him, Watt saw his plough iron still cold beside hinges and sickles. Eleanor counted pennies on the threshold, while Martin counted charcoal, bread, and promises, each number spoken loudly enough to become an accusation. By the next market day, Martin measured heat as carefully as coin. The charcoal burners had raised their price, blaming wet roads, guarded woodland, and the Lord's hungry wagons. Martin let no apprentice heap fuel by habit. 1 basket for nails, 2 for shoes, none for work paid only in soft words. At the doorway, customers heard a new answer from him. Bring iron, bring payment, or wait until the fire could be spared. Clean bar iron became too dear to trust to ordinary wants. Martin sorted the village's failures into piles, cracked hinges, horseshoes worn thin at the toe, cart bands split on rutted roads, scraps brought back from the campaign with mud still in the rivets. Each piece had to be judged, heated, cut, and coaxed. Some welded soundly, some opened like bad promises. His skill sharpened as the iron world narrowed. What came at dusk, cap twisted in both hands, the same plowshare Martin had mended when he first opened his own hearth. The edge was torn again, and tomorrow's fieldwork could not wait. Watt offered half a sack of rye now, the rest after rent was paid. Martin looked at the thin iron, the low charcoal, and Eleanor's ledger. Neither man raised his voice, but old trust stood between them like cold metal. Inside the house, scarcity had no sparks, only quiet scraping. Eleanor cut the rye loaf thinner, set weaker ale before the children, and marked rent, meal, salt, charcoal, and unpaid work in the same cramped hand. Martin had a fuller doorway now, a known mark, men who called him master. Yet his youngest watched the knife pause over the bread, and he understood that short iron had entered his own table. So Martin set the work in order where all could hear. A paid horseshoe for the miller's mule came before a brass latch for pride. Watt's plough iron came before a new knife, but not without rye on the bench. Some cursed him as hard-hearted, some lowered their eyes and fetched scrap. At the forge doorway, eagerness left his name. Necessity took its place, and villagers feared needing him more than they hated his terms. Long after the village lamps died, Martin kept the forge breathing in short, costly pulls. Watt's plowshare lay in the coals beside a cart pin promised against tax coin, and Eleanor's ledger waited open by the rushlight. He had saved too little charcoal for a second heat. Smoke blurred the iron's color. His shoulders ached, his eyes watered, and when the metal came out, he raised the hammer by memory more than judgment. The first blow landed true. The second glanced, ringing wrong against the anvil. Martin's hammer hand shivered as if the iron had struck back through the handle. He closed his fist, laughed once, and blamed the poor light, then reached for the tongs before anyone could speak. For Eleanor had seen the hammer dip, and the boy at the bellows stopped pulling. Watt's plowshare cooled half-shaped between them. Chapter 11. The Hand That Falters. Before cockcrow, Martin was already at the hearth, coaxing last night's ash around a stingy nest of charcoal. His fingers would not close cleanly, old burns pulled white across the knuckles, and his back complained before the bellows moved. Smoke narrowed his breath, but he hid the cough in his sleeve. If the fire failed, Watt's iron, the Reeves' dues, Eleanor's bread, and every debt at the doorway failed with it. By mid-morning, the Reeves man rode in with a wagon strap split near the axle, the cart waiting loaded with old grain and campaign gear. He wanted it mended before noon, from the same tired iron, with no waste and no excuses. Martin felt his hand throb inside the glove. Still, before the doorway and the watching customers, he nodded. A refused order could cost more than charcoal. The strap came out a dull orange, not bright enough, but Martin trusted the old habit and lifted it anyway. Halfway to the anvil, his fingers opened. The tongs clattered, the iron struck the hearthstone, and heat bit through his glove as he tried to catch it. He made one raw sound. Eleanor swept the boy back, kicked sand over the fallen strap, and seized Martin's wrist before pride could drag him nearer. For 3 days, the hammer sounded only in short, angry bursts. Martin's hand lay bound in linen, swollen stiff as a root, and each grip reopened the pain. At the doorway came sickles, hinges, loose shoes, a cart pin, all carried by people who had waited once before and feared waiting again. Eleanor stood over the ledger, naming delays gently. Behind her, unfinished iron gathered in a dark pile, each piece a debt cooling into danger. When Watt brought a gelding with one shoe half torn loose, Martin stepped forward before the boy could lift the hoof. The rival smith's nephew watched from the road. Martin shaped the shoe too quickly, struck once with his bad hand, and the branch twisted out of line. Set against the hoof, it rocked. Watt's mouth tightened. Martin remembered crooked apprentice nails, but now the shame bore his own mark, his own rent, his own table. That night, Eleanor spread the ledger beside the cold supper. Rent due at Michaelmas, charcoal owed to the burner, rye nearly gone, the Reeves tax marked in red. Watt's payment still promised, 3 shoes unfinished, 2 hinges delayed, and the axle strap spoiled. Martin stared at the columns as if they were iron he could heat straight. Eleanor touched his bandaged hand. The forge, she said, could not live inside one failing fist. By the next heat, Martin let the boy take the lighter hammer. He stood close enough to stop him, far enough to be seen not striking. Now, not there. Edge first. Let the colour tell you. Each wrong blow tightened Martin's jaw. Each watching face at the doorway felt like a guild searcher's eye. Then the strap began to draw true. Martin lowered his bandaged hand and gave the next command instead of the next blow. So the forge changed shape around Martin's wound. He sat nearer the anvil's end, reading heat, naming blows, refusing bad work before it cooled. Eleanor met customers at the doorway with the ledger open, taking coin, grain, promises, and anger in equal measure. The boy pumped bellows, carried tongs, and struck under Martin's eye. Some villagers muttered at the slower pace. Still, smoke rose before dawn. The fire had outgrown one man's hand. Chapter 12. Boys at the Bellows. 2 boys came to the forge threshold before the morning heat was built. One had been sent by a tenant mother with no coin and too many children. The other stood beside a carter who offered a small entry payment in a leather purse. Martin flexed his bandaged hand and knew refusal would cost him. Eleanor turned the ledger's thin pages. Martin studied their shoulders, eyes, and fear as Osric once had studied him. Long before the village cock cried, Martin put the new boys to work. One hauled charcoal by the basket, one scraped ash, then both carried water until their arms shook. At the bellows, Martin did not seize the handles to show strength. He tapped the beam, raised 2 fingers, and listened. Slow. Hold. Now breathe. The fire brightened evenly, and the boys understood this was not punishment. It was the shop's lungs. At mid-morning, the smaller boy spoiled 6 nails in a row. He drove the iron too white, struck off center, and left bent shanks cooling like accusations beside the anvil. Charcoal was dear, clean iron dearer. Martin's anger rose hot because he remembered Osric's stare, his own crooked first work, the laugh from the doorway. Again, he said sharply, but not cruelly. Watch the color. Watch the color. Strike square. The boy tried until 1 nail could be kept. Watt arrived with a cracked plough strap and saw the uneven hammer marks before Martin could turn the piece. His eyes moved from the iron to the apprentice. Martin might have taken it back, smoothed every fault, and sold certainty. Instead, he stood beside the boy at the anvil. Finish it where he can see. The blows came slower, truer. Watt grumbled over the price, but carried the strap away under Martin's mark. By evening, apprenticeship no longer looked like extra hands. It looked like 2 boys tearing bread from Martin's flour, sleeping shoulder to shoulder near the coal shed, needing hose patched, lice combed, quarrels stopped, and lies caught before they became habits. Eleanor set the pot between them and said cheap labour still ate dear grain. Martin looked from the ledger to the boys and weighed tomorrow's forge against tonight's hunger. The rush came with 3 customers waiting and a sickle at yellow heat. Rob pulled the bellows as if strength could buy time, while Will stared at the doorway and missed the iron brightening toward ruin. Flame leapt from the coals. Martin's wrapped hand twitched uselessly toward the tongs. Rob, stop. Will, rake it clear. Eleanor, water. The shop obeyed in pieces, and the sickle survived because Martin's voice struck where his hand could not. After that, Martin divided the work more finely. Rob drew nail rods and shaped hooks. Will cut horseshoe blanks, mended straps, and filed plain fittings for doors and carts. Martin inspected each piece by eye, thumb, and ring against the anvil. Some went back to the fire. Some joined the paid pile. At last he let Will strike the small shop mark beneath his own. The income steadied, and so did the danger. A carter from town brought a broken fitting unlike Martin's old patterns, with a neat steel edge riveted where plain iron would once have served. Rob and Will leaned close, asking how it held so thin. Martin turned it under the light, hearing Osric's old warnings in his head and the market's new voice at the door. He did not call it foolish. He only said, "Watch it. You may need what I was never taught." Chapter 13. New Edges, Old Fire. At market day, a peddler unfolded cloth beside the forge door and showed a town-made knife, narrow-backed and keen enough to shave a curl from horn. Men who had paid Martin for plainer blades passed it hand to hand and glanced toward his anvil. Martin felt the insult first, then the craft. He took the knife, tested its balance, studied the filed bevel and hardened edge, while Will and Rob watched his silence. Will pointed before Martin spoke. "Master, the edge is drawn thinner, then filed clean after hardening. See how the light runs even?" Rob snorted, but Martin raised one scarred finger. "Do not teach before you can prove," he said. Then he set the knife beside their own blank. "But do not stop seeing." The words cost him more than a rebuke. His eyes were still sharp, yet not as young. What came with his plowshare wrapped in sacking, the edge worn blunt by wet, stubborn clay? He had heard town iron held longer and wanted no old patch. Martin nearly answered sharply, then weighed the cost of pride against spring bread. He set Will to watch the color, scarfed a narrow strip onto the worn edge, welded it at careful heat, and filed the face clean until scarce iron served better, not merely more. Soon, wealthier doors in the parish began to swing on another man's iron. A smith 2 villages over sold hinges with cleaner curls, locks that turned smoothly, latches filed bright enough for a steward's hall. Martin mocked the shine until Eleanor showed him the ledger, fewer household fittings, more grudging plough work. At the doorway, he understood. Iron no longer merely kept weather and thieves out. It also announced who could afford grace. The new file cost nearly as much as a sack of meal. Martin turned it in his hands, angry at its fine teeth and at wanting it. Eleanor opened the ledger beside the cooling hearth. Charcoal owed, what's half payment, 2 boys eating daily. "If Will can finish hinges with it," she said, "it buys more than pride." Martin laid the file on the bench, not as treasure, but as debt trusted to younger hands. A retainer roared in with a bundle of bent buckles and a strip of parchment marked with lengths for harness plates and crossbow hooks. "All alike," he said. "The captain will not have men fumbling in the rain." Martin saw then that war no longer asked only for heavy blows. It asked for sameness. He put Will at the bench with rule, shears, and file, measuring each piece twice before the fire took it. Then a young steward asked for a thin, showy spur, all bright points and weak shank, to impress men at a feast. The coin was good. Martin held the bar, thought of charcoal, Watt's plough, Will's careful measuring, and his own mark on foolish iron. He handed it back. He would file hinges finer and fit war gear evenly, but he would not spend heat on metal that boasted before it served. For the next harness order, Martin did not take the tongs first. He stood behind Will, bad hand tucked against his belt, and let the boy read the color, call the bellows, and send the younger lads for water and charcoal. Once, Martin tapped the anvil edge, and Will corrected the bend before the metal cooled. By dusk, the pieces matched, strong and clean, and the shop had worked as one body. Chapter 14. The Night of Every Order. By late afternoon, clouds pressed low over the thatch, and Martin's doorway filled before the lamps were lit. Watt came first, reaping hooks cracked from stony ground. Behind him, a carter dragged in a wheelband split wide, then the miller's man held up a torn hinge like a wound. Last came the reeve, dry-cloaked and impatient, demanding wagon fittings by morning. Martin flexed his stiff fingers and saw the truth at once. One hammer would not carry this night. Eleanor set the ledger on a stump beside the anvil, its pages warped by smoke and damp fingers. "What owes grain, not coin," she murmured. "The carter can pay after market. The mill cannot wait, or half the village loses flour." While she faced Watt and the Reeve with a sharper tongue than Martin's, he pointed Will to the hooks, sent Rob for charcoal, and counted survival before iron. Martin set the forge like a board of pieces. Will took the finer bench, cutting nails true and mending straps where a crooked hole would shame them. Big Rob worked the bellows and rough heats, shoulders rising in the fireglow. Little Tom ran for charcoal and water, slipping through waiting boots. Martin kept the welds, the quench, the last look. His bad hand throbbed, but every command landed where strength could answer it. Then the miller's man shoved forward, rain already ticking on his hood. The grain cart's iron tire had sprung, and one fitting hung cracked from the wheel. Martin looked from it to the Reeves' waiting harness pieces, hearing in his mind the sacks that would spoil if the road turned mud. "Heat that band," he ordered Will. The Reeves' mouth tightened, but Martin chose the cart. A lord could rage. Wet grain fed no one. The Reeve stepped over the threshold, rain on his boots and anger in his jaw. Martin did not raise his voice. He laid out 4 horseshoes, 2 wagon straps, spear sockets still rough, then opened his palm toward the shrinking charcoal heap and the last sound bars of iron. Shoes first, straps next, spearwork after the weld holes. The Reeve stared at the fire and at last understood that command itself could not make metal hot. At midnight, the hard weld came white from the coals, and Martin's hammer hand failed him. The blow glanced. Will caught the tongs before the seam opened, panic bright on his face. He struck too flat, spreading the iron wrong. "Edge first," Martin rasped. "Now close it. Listen." Will changed the angle, matched the fire's breath, and the joint took. Martin nodded once, scarred hand lowered, mastery still present, but no longer alone. Deeper in the night, the forge ceased to be Martin's shop alone. Eleanor passed bowls of watered pottage, took promises, and kept angry men from crowding the anvil. Watt brought a broken hinge for scrap. Another neighbor carried in charcoal under his cloak. The boys changed places without being told. Bellows to hammer, hammer to trough. Martin refused 2 jobs, spared 3, and learned the village was working through his fire. By the pale edge before sunrise, the last horseshoe hissed beside the quench tub, and a wagon fitting lay straight enough for the road. The ledger was still scarred with unpaid marks. Watt's sickles still needed sharpening by noon. Yet the cart could move. The Reeve had iron to carry away, and Will banked the coals with steady hands. Martin watched him, understanding that a master's strength now lived in judgment, trust, and those taught to keep the fire. Chapter 15. Master of the Morning Fire. Long before the apprentices stirred, Martin crossed the forge threshold alone. The morning was cold, the smoke stale, the charcoal stacked in black silence, just as it had been when he was a frightened boy under Osric's eye. Now he moved slowly, knees stiff, scarred fingers testing the banked coals and setting each tool where waking hands would find it. He feared no fire. He only knew how many lives waited for it. Across the bench, Martin's fingers counted the years. Osric's old hammer, dark at the haft, still seemed to correct his grip. The journeyman tongs bore a notch from roadwork and hunger. His thumb found the anvil edge where his first household mark had been struck. Beside them lay the newer file Will favoured, the fuller bought on credit, the punch used for campaign rivets, each tool holding a debt, a wound, a lesson. Then the house behind the forge began to stir. Eleanor came first with bread wrapped in cloth and the account board under her arm, naming who owed grain, who needed trust, and who would pay in coin. Will roused the younger boys. One carried charcoal, another filled the quench bucket, another swept ash from the hearth. A loose pot hook waited beside horseshoe blanks. Breakfast, debt, discipline, and iron all entered the same morning. Will set a narrow bar too deep in the coals while the younger boy dragged the bellows hard, proud of the roaring flame. Martin heard the waste before he saw it. He tapped Will's wrist with two scarred fingers and drew the iron back. Not louder, truer. The boy flushed, waiting for anger. Martin only turned the bar toward the right color, remembering ruined metal under Osric's stare. Heat eats charcoal. Charcoal costs trust. By full light, the doorway crowded. Watt's son came with a cracked coulter and his father's old promise of grain. A carter held up a split-wheel strap. A woman wanted hinges before winter damp warped her door. Two horses waited stamping for shoes. Someone asked for nails, someone for a knife edge, someone for credit. They called Martin master now, yet every respectful nod carried a demand. Keep our fields, roads, doors, and debts from failing. Martin lifted one hand, and the shop found its pace. Will struck the hinge strap when Martin nodded. The younger boy drew out nail rods between heats. Another rasped a sickle edge bright. Outside, a horse stamped while its shoe warmed for fitting. Eleanor marked Watt's grain promise and moved the carter behind the mill hinge. Martin's strength was no longer in every blow, but in choosing the order that kept all blows useful. When the horseshoe came bright from the fire, Martin closed his tongs and felt his fingers fail to answer cleanly. Old burns pulled tight across his palm. Smoke caught in his chest. He could still read the heat, still see the nail holes true, but the hammer felt farther away than it once had. After one careful blow, he passed it to Will. Pride stayed in his voice as he said, "Now finish it." From the doorway, Martin watched smoke fold into the pale morning. Eleanor's voice moved over the ledger. Villagers shifted with tools in their arms. Will set the finished shoe beside the quench and reached for the next heat. The bellows drew in, pressed out, drew in again. Once, that breath had tested a frightened boy. Now it fed a house, a trade, and a village still waiting for iron.